Hi, my name is Jon Perkins. I'm a managing director at Slalom. I lead our cloud go-to-market capabilities for the West and Canada. I strongly believe in the value of context engineering as it relates to any AI solutions. Over the past couple of years, we've started to re-envision the SDLC leveraging AI. This has really been a focus around iteratively growing context throughout the SDLC. And with that, we're able to kind of maximize the value of GitHub Copilot. So with that, let's get into it. One of the things we've really seen over the last couple years is the SDLC being flipped on its head with AI, and GitHub Copilot is really making this possible at the end of the day. Most importantly, we really see this as an evolution of roles within the SDLC. And so what we're seeing firstly is this idea of what we call at Slalom a solution owner or technical project manager, scrum master slash business system analyst. How can we set the initial product context for GitHub Copilot? So what that looks like is taking all of your requirement gathering sessions, recording them, grabbing any additional context you can find. You might have maybe a PowerPoint, video recordings, other documentation about this potential product you're looking to create or build. And it's all about harvesting all of that context in and then using prompts that are few-shotted, meaning I have examples, and producing standard project deliverables. Like you might build a project charter first, and then I'm going to iterate with that project charter with the AI tool. And then when I'm done with that project charter, I'm going to add that to my context heap. And then I might build something like personas, add that to my context heap, and keep iterating from there. But really what I'm starting to do is set the foundation of product context for GitHub Copilot at the end of the day. From there, we see the role of experience architect and experience designers change. One of the things that we are going to get to is essentially a series of context and constraints or rules. And this is all going to be within Markdown that gets referenced from GitHub Copilot. So what I can do is I can firstly use that project context that we've generated and start to create standard experience architecture deliverables like user flows and sitemaps and define them in Mermaid.js, which is a text to diagram, diagram to text technology. And that's really impactful because LLMs and GitHub Copilot understand text really, really well. And then what I can do is I can suck in my design system into my context and constraint framework. And therefore, that's all my fonts, all my colors, essentially all my components as well. I might be using a design system out of the box like Material UI, but I'm going to take that all in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my experience architect actually use GitHub Copilot to prototype in the form of single page applications. So think like a React app or Angular or Vue app. And then that's going to essentially build on that context and those constraints. Then my technical architects are going to ingest that context as well. Again, use Mermaid to essentially create architecture to not only align the team, but also to constrain GitHub Copilot and the code that it writes to follow that architecture in the future. One of our Slalom best practices is to maintain C4 level diagrams for the lifecycle of the project. And what this allows me to do at the end of the day, I'm going to take all this context in, and then as a developer, a quality engineer, a DevOps engineer, I can leverage all that context and constraints to write code very, very accurately, and not just accurately, but more consistently. So what I mean by that is I write code that's not just generically trained, but I write code that has all the practices and patterns from my enterprise. And so I'm getting rid of the need to say, hey, I need a 5 or 10-year developer to do this. I'm going to steal those patterns and practices, it could be my enterprise architecture, it could be my development patterns, and I'm going to distill that all down into my constraints. Therefore, GitHub Copilot writes code like a 5 to 10-year developer in my organization. Also, this helps from an enterprise architecture perspective. So instead of catching things on the back end, you can bring that all up into the front end. The other key piece is we're going to use MCP servers to dynamically retrieve context. So think if I'm working in the back end, I might dynamically read my database via an MCP server and write more accurate data access code. I might use a cloud-based MCP server to read documentation. And then that documentation can help me validate my infrastructure as code, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really kind of how we see roles evolving across the SDLC. And really to explain this context of building a context and constraint framework or memory bank for GitHub Copilot, as well as MCP integration, we've taken this really simple example of saying, hey, let's say you added a developer to your team, like a human developer. Really, this is a metaphor for GitHub Copilot. If you ask them to write code off the bat, it's probably not going to be the best experience or result. But then if I gave them the context of the project, like what are we looking to achieve? Here's the architecture of the project. Here's the technologies we're going to use. I'm going to get an even better output at the end of the day. And then if I asked that developer, or I gave that developer all my enterprise context, here are all my development standards for various languages, C#, Java, React, et cetera, as well as from an enterprise architecture perspective, here's my best practices for observability. I'm going to use OTel, et cetera, et cetera. If I give my new developer that, they're going to even write better output. And then finally, if I tell that developer, you're allowed to go talk to all the various systems that might be Jira or Azure DevOps for user stories. That might be the backend, the database as I write data access code. If I am creating designs in Figma, I want to view that when I'm creating front-end code. That is the context of dynamic context via MCP. So that is essentially how we are essentially framing this all up, whether it be a human or whether it be GitHub Copilot. And so these key pieces to unlock the SDLC, the first biggest piece is GitHub Copilot in agent mode at the end of the day. That is really where I'm going to be able to set an objective and essentially leverage that context and constraints and MCPs to essentially write code. Big unlock is Mermaid diagrams. Again, that's that text to diagram, diagram to text, because AI can really understand text. The biggest thing that we are doing at the end of the day is through the use of Copilot instructions markdown file, creating essentially a memory system or a memory bank that has all that context and constraints that I've described previously, that is essentially referenced from my Copilot instructions. And that's going to be hierarchical in nature in the sense that I only want to pull the appropriate context or constraints as it makes sense. And then lastly, MCP servers, as I've mentioned, they're really kind of that dynamic context. So what does this look like at the end of the day? Think a world in which a developer uses their IDE, that might be something like VS Code and GitHub Copilot, and that is their single pane of glass for the day. They log in, they say, go implement Jira story or Azure DevOps story 1, 2, 3. It's going to go ahead and read that story. It's going to go reference your context and constraint framework or memory bank. It's going to load the appropriate context and constraints or rules. And then what it's going to do is it's going to dynamically talk to any additional MCP servers that make sense. For instance, like a database server when you're MCP, when you're writing the backend, and understand that database schema dynamically, write that code and then update your Jira story. And we really see this as kind of the future of work with GitHub Copilot. The other thing you'll see here is a Slalom Accelerator at the bottom. Anytime that you might have a asynchronous agentic workflow as part of your development that you don't want to wait on, we've essentially exposed that as an MCP server back to GitHub Copilot. So with that, we've had a wonderful opportunity to pilot this at many clients. I've recently worked on a large financial services client that went through all of this. What we did at that client was we educated their product team. We went through the whole process of recording all our requirements gathering for this new product they were looking to build. We used few shot prompts. We built deliverables like essentially a project charter, personas, a quality engineering strategy, architecture diagrams in Mermaid, as well as an epic level backlog, and then decomposed that backlog and pushed it to their Jira. Huge uplift from AI and the use of few shot prompts to get there. But the light bulb kind of popped in their eyes that, hey, I'm building all these project deliverables to both align humans as well as GitHub Copilot. And that was kind of a big unlock for them. And then when we showed them this use of taking all of that information that was created from this project discovery and essentially creating a memory bank out of that in the form of markdown files for GitHub Copilot to reference. The other thing that we did is we asked them to say, hey, like, what are your best practices for the particular development languages? And they're like, yeah, we don't really have that documented. So what we did was GitHub Copilot. We essentially used a GitHub MCP server to read a few good projects that they thought were really gold standards of what good architecture or what development practices look like. We distilled that down into rules and then essentially cached that within our memory bank. And then we also read about their platform they're looking to deploy to. So everything that they did was all Kubernetes based. So we read that from Confluence. We read all their standards around Docker, around Helm, and we put that into our memory bank. And then what we did is we wrote code in this new format here. And we essentially did A/B testing with and without a memory bank and MCP integration. And they were pretty blown away by the fact that the code generated with GitHub Copilot out of the box versus when they had all of this context and all of these rules, the code not only was highly contextual for what they were looking to do, but followed all their best practices. So for instance, at the API level, they had proper API versioning, they had proper commenting, they had proper air handling, they had proper logging, et cetera, and they were pretty wowed by this. And now we are scaling this across the entire client's organization, all possible through GitHub Copilot.